as we know, the US and the current White House loves the word deal. They want to announce deals and wins and so many things. I have to say, I've never seen so little detail about so much money involved.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today we'll be discussing the new strategic partnership announced between the U.S. government and the owners of Westinghouse Electric that, if triggered, would see the deployment of $80 billion worth of Westinghouse nuclear reactors in the United States. But before we get into the partnership and what it means for the globe, let's do some introductions. We have three voices that will be familiar to longtime listeners and one new voice, and that's me. I'm AJ Camacho, or Francisco Camacho, your guest host today. I'm a reporter for Politico and E&E News, where I cover the U.S.'s Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and, of course, nuclear power. But to those of you who, like me, love the voice of Decouple's usual host, Chris Keefer, fear not. He joins us as a quote-unquote guest today, alongside Michael Seeley and Yuri Humber. Chris really needs no introduction for this podcast, but I'll give him one anyways out of habit. Chris is president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. In that capacity, he led the successful campaign to save and refurbish the Pickering nuclear generating station and orchestrated a U-turn shift in the Canadian federal government from an anti to pro-nuclear position over the last decade. Chris is a staunch proponent of Canadian national interest, particularly as it intersects with the Great White North's highly strategic can-do nuclear industry. Chris, how does it feel to be on the other side of the show?
Well, I'm excited. I've done this a couple times before. I've had my friend Jesse Freeston, who has actually interviewed me for the very first episode of Decouple. So people were to stagger back, 400 episodes or something. They would hear me, kind of in the guest chair as well. But this is going to be fun. And I'm really honored to be here alongside two former Decouple guests, Yuri and Michael, who I have immense respect for. And again, just a testament to this wonderful kind of network that we're developing here at Decouple with world experts who can comment on kind of near breaking news through the lightning of fiber optic cable.
It's amazing what we can do this day and age. And indeed, I've spoken to multiple of you before and was actually planning to speak with you already for my own work. So like you said, we have the cream of the crop here. Speaking of which, Yuri Humber is president of the research and consulting firm Yuri Group, and he is the founder and chief editor of the Japan NRG Energy Intelligence Service, which focuses on the Japanese market. Yuri, I understand that you've been to a number of, I think you called them exotic nuclear facilities in your time, from a Siberian enrichment facility to Iran, Fukushima Daiichi. Do you have a favorite of these various sort of niche places you've been to?
Thank you, first of all, for the really kind introduction from both of you. I think I just want to say this. I suppose one of the oddest things is, so even though I'm a Brit, I was born in a town called Gomel, which is about 100 kilometers north of Chernobyl. And is in modern-day Belarus. And I was there, obviously I was the age of 6 when the Chernobyl disaster happened, and the various fallouts from that. And then I moved to Japan about 3 months before the Fukushima disaster, having covered nuclear energy when I was with Bloomberg in Russia and the former Soviet Union space. So then once I arrived, obviously, I asked the team, the energy team in Tokyo, said, do you need any help on nuclear? I know the industry pretty well, would love to get involved. And I was told, no, nothing ever happens. It's just such a deadbeat. And then, bam. Suddenly, I'm the only person in the bureau who knows what a millisievert is. But the funny thing is that then my colleagues say, look, if you have this experience of Chernobyl and you just arrived here just before Fukushima, then please let us know when you move country next, because we want to make sure we're not there. I guess, look, this is maybe just a really long intro, but a quick way to say that I think, a lot of nuclear facilities can seem pretty, bland, big industrial things that are made from, cement and essentially not entirely aesthetically pleasing, I suppose. But one thing that I found really neat was inside one of the Russian nuclear power plants. Inside one of the rooms, they had a greenhouse inside because of the heat from the reactor, and it just made like the really nice contrast with all the cement and the tiled, sort of like bathroom tile kind of tiles on the wall, and then there you have some vegetables growing on a patch near a reactor building. So yeah, probably that one.
That's a really neat idea. The marketing guru Rory Sutherland says that nuclear's big problem is that it has a name like nuclear, and it hasn't marketed himself well. So maybe we just need to have greenhouses at all of these nuclear generating facilities. That's great to have you on, Yuri. And then, of course, last but not least, Michael Seeley. He is the Atomic Blender on YouTube and a consultant. He is professionally licensed nuclear engineer with about 2 decades of experience in the industry, including many years in the United Arab Emirates, helping that country install its first nuclear power plant. Now, notable for our episode, he also worked on, I believe it was core design at Westinghouse. Is that right, Michael?
Yep, that's correct.
And notable for me, he also worked briefly at my hometown nuclear power plant, San Onofre, in California before it shut down. But now he lives in Vienna, Austria, which I find interesting. I often look at the livability rankings from like the Economist Intelligence Index. Vienna's often at the top of the list. I mean, Michael, do you find that that's warranted?
I do find Vienna to be quite nice, and it also being the home and headquarters of the UN's body, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Of course, there's a strong nuclear connection here as well. So between livability and nuclear energy, I think Vienna is a fantastic home and a fantastic place to be.
What more can someone want? Great. Well, let's get into this $80 billion partnership as it's been advertised between the U.S. Commerce Department and the owners of Westinghouse, Camacho, and Brookfield Asset Management. The headline is $80 billion. Of course, there's a lot of things that need to be triggered, and eventually, if enough things go right, the U.S. government could end up even taking a 20% equity stake in Westinghouse. But before I get too much into that deal, Chris, I'm hoping that you can just give us like a very SparkNotes history of Westinghouse since it announced plans for the AP1000, just to get any folks up to speed, although I frankly imagine our listeners are pretty well acquainted with Westinghouse.
I'd like to take some editorial liberty and actually jump back a little bit further because I think part of why this is such a significant deal is sort of the space in which Westinghouse as kind of a mythology exists within the U.S. Discourse, and that is of course because it emerges alongside Ford Motors, the Rockefeller Empire, Edison, GE, from a charismatic inventor genius who created this industrial stack, starting, of course, with the railroad air brake, which was absolutely revolutionary. George Westinghouse drilled for natural gas famously in his, I think, the backyard of his mansion in a wealthy Pittsburgh neighborhood. Developed a lot of the natural gas distribution empire and technologies. Of course, there was the War of the Currents with Edison. And laid the groundwork for our modern electricity grid, with AC ultimately winning for distribution anyway. And more broadly, what happens to Westinghouse as we move through, the last century very much is reflective of broader trends within the U.S. economy and its transition towards, a consumer society and then sort of service and now financialization and media. Because Westinghouse, of course, starts to create demand for the electricity that it's creating in the system it's made, first with radios and then in the post-war boom, appliances, fridges, ranges, washing machines, and ultimately gets into become a creditor to incent the ability for the consumer to buy these goods. And then the credit business gets a little risky and crazy as they sort of stretch the limits of that, making risky real estate deals. And this sort of blows up the company in the 80s and 90s. And Westinghouse sheds its industrial stack, sells off its transformer business to AB&B, sells off its turbine business to Siemens, and hives off Westinghouse Electric Company, its nuclear business, and sort of finishes its metamorphosis into a media company in which the true lineage of Westinghouse, if you track it through, it is now CBS. So I just think that's like some interesting context. And in our sort of MAGA moment, where I think there's a lot of nostalgia for, the industrial roots, and the kind of glory days, particularly with the kind of insecurity that I think Americans feel seeing China's rise as the manufacturing hub of the world. I think that speaks a little bit to, when Chris Wright is asked, isn't Westinghouse a Canadian company? And he says, no, this is an American company. It's a legacy American company. That's what's being harkened back to. So, I did want to be, an ungracious guest and sort of steer the line editorially, but I think that context is really important framing for this conversation.
No, absolutely, and I welcome it completely. And as we sort of mentioned at the beginning, after there was a bankruptcy that Westinghouse underwent. It's now in the joint ownership of Brookfield and Camacho, which, as you just alluded to, Chris, both Canadian companies. Although Brookfield, I guess, is part U.S., part Canadian. But this deal, I want to take a moment before we get into what this might mean for Canada, given that ownership, which I know you have some thoughts on, Chris, as I've read on your LinkedIn. But Michael, if you could just start, because you did the Atomic Blender video on this, I figured you'd be a great person to just walk us through what are the key bits that we know and don't know about this strategic partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's a couple of things to keep in mind as context for all of this. Like Chris talked about, there's this kind of legacy of Westinghouse, this massive former industrial on the scale of like General Electric or some of the other companies of the era, where there are these large conglomerates that do all kinds of activities, and nuclear being one of them. So when we talk about the context of this deal, and this is something that the Brookfield CEO has talked about, is that this is to reinvigorate the American industrial base and reestablish the supply lines for nuclear energy in America, which again, if you look over the past, couple of decades, there hasn't been a lot of activity. There's been 2 plants that have come online, finishing one plant that had been mothballed in the 1970s and 80s, eventually comes online. But over the last few decades, the infrastructure for building nuclear plants in the U.S. just isn't there. So that's the context for this entire framework and this idea of this $80 billion. And when we talk about the $80 billion, this isn't just the U.S. government is going to write a check to Westinghouse and they're going to go off and build $80 billion of AP1000s or whatever. And at maybe current estimates of around $10 billion per plant, we're talking roughly 8 plants. But what is actually in this deal is a series of triggers and conditions. And so the first one is the government is going to sign on to what it calls final investment decision and decisive agreements. And what that means is the government is going to have some sort of participation in these activities. The press releases do not specify exactly what the nature of those arrangements are looking like. And in preparing for this, talking to Westinghouse, talking to the Japanese consortiums, nobody really knows exactly what the framework of this deal is going to look like. At least they're not publicly saying it. Everybody's saying, look at the press release, and that's all we know at this point. It's kind of fast evolving information, and we hope to know more soon. So what we can do is look at the actual press release, which does contain the details of this. And like I said, that involves the final investment decision and commitment of support, things like licensing. So what the U.S. government can do is, through a couple of different mechanisms, either provide direct financial support for these plants through things like the Loan Programs Office, through the Department of Energy, where it either provides the money directly through the federal banks or through commercial banks with reduced interest rates. Because nuclear plants are quite capital intensive, this is a way to reduce the cost of those plants up front. 2 other mechanisms that the federal government would likely be involved is through a couple of tax credits, the production tax credit and the infrastructure tax credit. These are kind of options for either building the plant, reducing the cost of building the plant if it's clean energy, or operating the plant and then you make the money back over the next 10 years or so that you are getting additional tax credits in order to produce it. So these are 2 other ways that the federal government could come in. One interesting quote from the CEO, Bruce Flatt, CEO of Brookfield, he was on CNBC a few days ago, and he stated that Westinghouse was going to build the plants and that the U.S. government was going to own them. which is a bit of a unusual condition. And when we look at the language of the press release, it doesn't say own, it does say finance and arrange permitting and instruction. So I assume that the Brookfield CEO knows what's going on. And when he says that the US government is owning them, he may either be referring to the financing or some other kind of ownership. But we haven't really seen the US government come in and take, full ownership of a nuclear plant, at least not directly. So that is the beginning step of what the US government may do with this $80 billion. What that does then is it then triggers the next step, and which is a vested interest. And a vested interest means that Westinghouse is going to make money off of these plants and off these projects and proceed. And the US government will take some portion of money after a certain amount of profit. And I'll fill in some specific numbers here because it does matter and it is a little bit confusing at times. So the agreement, as outlined, states that after Westinghouse pays out $17.5 billion, the U.S. government would take 20% of the cash after that. But this does not mean that profits or other sorts of money, so if Westinghouse is making money off of other services and things, these are cash distributions to owners. And currently, the two owners that we have are Camacho and Brookfield. And if we look back over the last year and a half or so, Westinghouse was bought by Brookfield and then eventually Camacho in late 2023. The amount of money that Westinghouse has paid out to those companies is $100 million. And they did that in February of this year. So if we look at what is the long-term deal going to look like, Westinghouse is not paying out an enormous amount of money over this period, at least so far in their ownership. Now, of course, that may change if they start building plants and they start getting additional services or fuel from those plants. That rate may increase. But right now, it doesn't look like Westinghouse is this, enormous cash cow that's going to spit off $17.5 billion over the next few years to its owners. All of those disbursements have to be agreed by the board of directors, which right now is a combination of Westinghouse, Camacho, and Brookfield. So it's not just a pure profit. Profits often get reinvested into things like R&D and other development projects. So it's not just free money coming from the government or free money coming from Westinghouse for building these projects and supporting these projects through licensing or other loan guarantees. So then what happens next? If Westinghouse in 2029 becomes worth $30 billion, and right now it's a private company, so we don't have public data on what the actual value is, but private bank estimates put it at around $27 billion, $28 billion. So it's not that far off. If Westinghouse as a company is worth $30 billion, the US government, and it has made this $80 billion of investments and other agreements, then the U.S. government can force Westinghouse to make a public IPO. It can become an initial public offering and become a public company. Then the government has an option. Its vested interest of getting this income from Westinghouse after $17.5 billion. This interest then converts into a warrant or an option, a call option, that can be converted in the future to not quite a 20% ownership stake. This is one thing that is also misleading, is that people say, Westinghouse in 5 years, they're going to be 20% owned by the government. It's not quite how it works. The structure is that the government gets a 20% equity stake in this new company after it goes public, while they have an option to buy 20% equity in this new company, only on the value over $17.5 billion. So at a $30 billion valuation, that leaves, you take off $17.5 billion, that leaves about $12.5 billion. 20% of that is $2.5 billion. So that becomes the value of the option that the government is holding. And so that would be the actual amount that the government would be able to take. And to actually get it, then they're not just going to take, 10% from Camacho and 10% from Brookfield. Because the company is now on the public market, new shares get issued. Public has the option to buy shares. Of course, this is a little bit at the discretion of Camacho and Brookfield as the majority holders. But in this kind of situation, new shares would be issued to the U.S. government. You would then dilute the Brookfield and Camacho and public holdings. And if you do the math on that, depending on at what value Westinghouse has, the U.S. government ends up owning somewhere between 8 and 16% of the company because of that $17.5 billion discount from the total value at IPO. So we have what initially looks like somewhat of a simple type of arrangement where the government's going to get 20% of the income after a certain point, and then they have the option to take 20% of the company. There's a lot of ifs in there, and there's a lot of conditions to discount or raise or lower the value of these different things. And one thing that, again, in the context of this is important to point out, when Westinghouse is going, let's say they go and they build these 8 AP1000s or whatever, Westinghouse is not going to be the constructor of those plants. They're not doing the EPC work, the engineering, construction, and procurement. That would be somebody else. Westinghouse, as part of their bankruptcy that Chris mentioned, the Vogtle project and the VC Summer project bankrupted Westinghouse and nearly took down their Japanese owner, Toshiba, at the time. Westinghouse has then since said they are exiting the construction business of nuclear plants. They're going to be a pure provider of engineering and services, and they will let somebody else, like Bechtel, manage the construction of the project. That's what they're doing in Poland, and that's what they've proposed they would do in other projects. So if Westinghouse goes and builds all of these new plants, they're going to be in a position where they're doing a lot of engineering work, engineering services, some component supply, which Westinghouse still does maintain. And these are much more low risk, potentially more profitable types of things to be involved with. So even if projects start to run late, if Westinghouse is not really at fault, they may still be profiting off of this. But nonetheless, these projects take a long time to complete. We know nuclear plants take, in the US, at least like 8, maybe 10 years. And the model, at least traditionally, has been that you make a lot more money on the back end. So selling fuel, selling services, selling maintenance. And a 5-year time frame for this contract to vest means that potentially there's a lot more income over the next 80 years, over the lifetime of the plant, rather than upfront during the construction. And so the government, US government, is actually taking, in my opinion, quite a good choice here, making a good option on themselves, where they have that option to say, okay, we'll take income now, or because we expect, income over the next 80 years of the lifetime of the plants that we supported building, we can turn that into equity now and be able to kind of cash in on that now, where the American taxpayer and the US government would then see some sort of upside. So in a nutshell, it's a fairly complicated deal, what looks like a simple one-page press release, but it's quite interesting in the way it's been structured.
I have to say, Michael, I'm really glad I handed that to you, because if I would have tried to summarize it, I would have been far less detailed. And frankly, I probably would have gotten 1 or 2 things a bit wrong. So thank you for that. That's fantastic. I think I want to do one last bit of ground laying here. That is that this Westinghouse announcement happened at the same time, and a lot of people have put forward that there could be a link between the two, as President Trump's visit to Japan and a big investment deal that happened there. So given we have our Tokyo correspondent Yuri here, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit. It's this investment deal has hundreds of billions of dollars, or at least up to hundreds of billions of dollars that might be on the line. There are provisions that might go to Westinghouse. I know you put out a good analysis about this the other day. So could you walk us through briefly what that deal is and how that might relate to this Westinghouse deal that we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think having listened to Michael, go through this, despite all the uncertainties, the many, many layers of ifs and buffs and complexities, warranties, and so on, very much a financial deal. And that is bullet point 1 of about 25 bullet points that form what is called a $550 billion investment agreement between US and Japan. Now, it is called investment deal. As we know, the US and the current White House loves the word deal. They want to announce deals and, wins and so many things. I have to say, I've never seen so little detail about so much money involved. There was about a page-and-a-half announcement by the Japanese ministry in charge, so the Ministry of Trade Industry, METI, listing all the different deals. So I can tell you, sure, the bullet point 1, as part of the so-called $330 billion investment potential, bullet point 1 is for Westinghouse, and it literally says Westinghouse to build AP1000 nuclear reactors, as well as SMRs, by the way. So this isn't just a AP1000 reactor story. And it just says that, Japanese partners like MH, Mitsubishi Heavy, Toshiba, and IHI would be involved. Just for that line item, it says up to $100 billion. $100 billion, by the way, if that is described as an investment, and yet we're talking about an $80 billion investment by the US government in AP1000, then my question is, wait, who's making the investment? What are these companies? Is that Westinghouse making the investment? Is that the US government making the investment? Is that Japanese government through state lenders and so on, making some kind of loan to the US side? The way that, again, the few details that we have, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the other so-called deals in this agreement, is that there is what under the previous prime minister Ishiba, his chief negotiator, who is now the chief minister of the minister of METI, Akazawa, he essentially spent about 5-6 months jet setting almost every second Friday to the US, to Washington, to negotiate what has been described as kind of a fund, and like a major, if you like, almost like a fund in which Japan injects a lot of money, but it is literally the President Trump who directs where that money is invested. So the full discretion in terms of the investment is on the US side. And yet the money is sort of provided by the Japanese side. So if you think of it like that, it's really not an industrial agreement or strategy. Or certainly not from the Japanese point of view, or very little of it. It's it's a financial arrangement in which, I suppose the U.S. is saying bankroll us to divert money in the directions that we want to be spending on. So this, just again, to maybe just a slight digression, but I think it's important to say that when when the Trump administration first came back into power in the last so at the beginning of the year, one of the key things that they wanted to discuss was how to get Japan and other countries, and by the way, Japan is the biggest debt owner, so the biggest holder of US debt, how to get them to kind of turn their debt into potentially 100-year debt, roll it over into 100-year bonds, or extremely long-term debt, and then essentially tax them on the earnings from the US bonds. For why? And this is the key issue, which we will basically need to see the entire deal through. The key deal being that the US is the defense guarantor for Japan. Okay, this is an extremely important sort of part of the entire complex, because you have Japan relying on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Of course, you have U.S. troops in Okinawa and other places stationed all over Japan. And, we live in Japan, we live in a neighborhood with North Korea, Russia, and China, all of which, have at some point, let's say, been a little unfriendly. So Japan relies on this defense pact, and therefore it sort of sees the U.S. partnership as more than just a partnership, but a really key relationship for its own security. I think the U.S. has always seen that to its advantage. because it also gives US a great vantage point into Asia, and is always been seen as a plus. But in terms of the way that let's say that the White administration has seen it, both in his first term and the second term, is they see it as sort of almost a liability. Like, we're protecting you, therefore you need to pay for this, and you are in no way providing enough information compared to the sort of the security. What is the value of security? Well, it's definitely a lot more than you're paying right now with the base, covering the costs of the bases and so on. So this brings us back to this $500 billion dollar deal. Essentially, we in our analysis piece, I wrote that this is an imperial tribute, and it really is. It's essentially sort of the US saying that we think the value of this security pact is much higher, and what you need to do as Japan is to make these financial contributions. We will decide how these capital flows will be spent, on where they will be invested. And I guess one sort of small crumb of comfort is that in some of the deals, Japanese companies may get preferential vendor treatment. So, is this really a fantastic deal from Japan? I mean, I guess the bigger question is, does the US even care? Obviously, the answer is no. But let's go back to this deal, because again, this is supposedly an investment deal, and yet it's not clear. If we're talking about Westinghouse, what investment is MHI making in AP1000s? What investment is Toshiba making in AP1000s? As Chris mentioned, Toshiba, you could argue, has gone down literally because of Westinghouse. I mean, it was a flourishing, one of the leading companies in Japan. It went through so many troubles because of that arrangement, and definitely for sure, some of it Toshiba's fault entirely. But because of that, it's now an unlisted. It had to delist. It went through some very difficult times, and it's unclear now whether it's really come out in a better shape. Now, IHI, for example, was one of the suppliers of components for the Vogtle units 3 and 4. So for sure, there's going to be, I think it's clear that there will be some contracts, potentially vendors' contracts, especially as we're talking about some favorable terms that MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy, Toshiba, and IHI, for example, could get. But how can we understand an investment if they're being talked about as vendors? That doesn't really line up. Plus SMRs, two Japanese companies, IHI and another JGC, are sort of minority investors in NewScale, the SMR producer, and certainly NewScale definitely figures in one of the deals. But it's unclear again how sort of Japan is going to be making any of those investments. GE Hitachi is another line item on this investment deal. Now, again, it talks about joint development of SMR model BWRX-300. I'm sure Chris has plenty of opinions on that technology as it's being sort of lined up in Darlington. But again, it says, according to the official statements, that this is an investment of up to $100 billion. I'm not clear if we're talking about Japanese investment, that what Hitachi would be providing up to $100 billion. These are fantastic sums. What on earth is Hitachi going to be investing $100 billion in? So if we are simply talking about the value of projects that would get done, then maybe, okay, potentially we okay, that's a huge market for GE Hitachi's SMR, up to $100 billion. But let's assume that that's sort of the potential. So what are we talking about here? Bechtel, actually, also, the EPC contractor for Vogtle. Yep, that's another one. It's on the list as providing EPC services for large-scale power and infrastructure with Japanese participation. Again, unclear what the, SoftBank Group has been talked about, and they've sort of announced, we're all in on, US AI infrastructure. But Kinder Morgan, natural gas transmission and infrastructure services, up to $7 billion. It's not clear who's the Japanese partner. What are they investing in? Is this even an investment? So Okay, so I could go on, but I think the main thing to say is that really, from where I stand, it looks like the US is locked in a massive competition over AI with China. Okay, that is the sort of the bottom line. So what is the goal? If you are trying to win the AI competition and you have leading IT companies that could certainly help you win that competition, well, they need power. So the power has to be built to power the data centers and so forth. It has been decided that you need nuclear power as the sort of the most, maybe reliable baseload that is also clean. Great. So then that means a revival of the nuclear industry in the US, as well as obviously a strong push in LNG. And certainly there's plenty of LNG projects that are being touted by the White House right now. And these projects need components, and certainly some Japanese vendors will be more than able and happy to provide components, provided this is actually a provision that can be done at market prices. And if this is entirely controlled by the US administration, that how can we be certain that that market price will be available? So then what is the Japanese participation? And it just comes down to, by the sound of it, that Japan will be lending that money. So instead of buying 100-year bonds, it'll be providing via quasi-state banks or state banks, either actual loans or guarantees. So this is sort of debt financing. And as Michael explained, the terms don't sound entirely attractive. So the Japanese minister in charge has tried to say, well, we're not going to be the only one financing this, but that's not the message that's coming from the US side. So all in all, to wrap it up, I just think that there's a massive amount of information without clarity how it all fits together. Japanese participation seems to be mainly on the financing side. Yes, Japanese companies would potentially get some benefit of being involved in US projects, and certainly many of them already have US subsidiaries that are very active in that market. But are we sure that this is going to be, a really profitable thing for Japan as a country, especially if the Japanese banks are extending, the financing towards that? It sort of kind of locks in Japan even further into this the U.S. market. And while it is an attractive market, Japan's strength has always been its diversity.
I'm curious, Chris, to turn over to you. Yuri paints this as a picture that, at least from what we know now, does not seem all that favorable towards Japan. We alluded to earlier with the Westinghouse strategic partnership with the government. I mean, at first glance, you got to think, oh, Canada's going to be in a great position. It has, two of its companies are co-owners of that. But I understand that you have, shall we say, a more nuanced take and have a lot more reservations about the deal's implications for Canada. And I should add, and if any of you all want to jump in on any of this, by all means. But yeah, Chris, talk me through. What do you think that the Westinghouse partnership, or for that matter, the Japanese investments into things like GE Hitachi, what does that stuff mean for Canada?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was contacted, such a flurry. I think both announcements happened actually on my son's birthday, October 28th. It was a lot for me to take in, but on that same day or the day after, I had a National Post journalist, that's one of our national daily newspapers, reach out to me and say, didn't Trump just cancel all the trade talks with Canada over Doug Ford's Reagan tariff ad? So now why is Trump giving Canada $80 billion or Canadian companies $80 billion? This is great for Canada, right? And as you're saying, obviously this is much more nuanced. So absolutely. I mean, Westinghouse is Canadian in ownership only, which sounds significant. I mean, if you think about owning your house or owning your car, I mean, you control it. But Westinghouse has been under a variety of different ownerships, actually 4 different ownerships in the last 26 years. As you mentioned, they were carved off from the mothership, the mother company, sold to British Nuclear Fuels, who held them and did very well, bought for about $1.2 billion, sold for, I think, 4.6 or 5.4, sorry, to Toshiba. As we mentioned, Toshiba's nuclear annihilation, as the Asianometry YouTube channel has called it, in a great video. People should check that out. Sale on to Brookfield business partners, and later this restructuring and sale to Camacho and Brookfield Asset Management, Brookfield Renewable Partners. So throughout those changes in ownership, Westinghouse has consistently been a U.S. company, as Chris Wright, Energy Secretary, said, a legacy U.S. company, headquartered in Pittsburgh, where George Westinghouse himself lived, drilled that natural gas well in his backyard, and set up a lot of this industrial ecosystem. Fuel fabrication down in, I believe, North or South Carolina. I'm a little sketchy on my U.S. geography. It's embarrassing as a Canadian that always makes fun of Americans for not knowing Canadian geography. But suffice it to say, a very U.S.-centric and globalized, frankly, industrial ecosystem as Westinghouse shed a lot of its capabilities and relied on the Koreans, for instance, for a lot of the heavy forgings for the AP1000. What I think is fascinating is this sounds like a massive scale investment, $80 billion. People are saying this is going to build 10 nuclear power plants. I think that is, highly, highly optimistic. Vogel, if you inflation adjust the entire investment stack, probably cost about 46 billion contemporary US dollars. So in any case, how many AP1000s that builds will be interesting. What I'd like to point out is Canada's and Ontario, my province's nuclear ambitions are actually far greater than that. We have plans in place to build probably 8 large reactors shared between the Bruce site, already the world's largest operating nuclear facility in the world, because Japan won't turn all its nukes back on. But we have a 6,400 megawatt nuclear plant with 8 Canada reactors churning out power in Bruce, planning to add up to 4,800 megawatts of large nuclear there. And also, we gave up the beautiful licensed Darlington site, which had 4,800 megawatts of nuclear licensed. We've made a very idiotic decision to fill that site up with 1,200 megawatts of SMRs, but we have chosen another site called Wesleyville to build, another 4,800 megawatts of capacity. And, that is, you can never say these things are firm or fixed in stone, but, I've always said nuclear is a need to have, not a nice to have technology. And the very reason that Ontario has a France-like, amount of nuclear generation on our grid is because, like the French, we didn't have oil, we didn't have gas, we didn't have coal, we didn't really have an alternative. And we were dependent on the Americans and to a small degree, Western Canada, to ship in coal once we outstripped our fairly abundant hydroelectric resources. And that's the extraordinary story of the construction of 20 large Canada reactors in 23 years in Ontario, and the legacy we have. And it looks like we're going to be adding on to that at quite a large scale. And so with that size of investment, Canada is struck with a very, very interesting decision, which, we've already decided which small modular reactor technology we're going to pursue. And while there's talk of the AP300, I think most people recognize that is a pipe dream. We can get into that for other reasons. But when it comes to our large nuclear reactor technology selection, this is a hugely consequential deal for Canada. We own Westinghouse, or at least, a U.S. headquartered private equity firm. Private equity ownership is a whole other, basket here. But we own Westinghouse. But again, the ecosystem is in the U.S. We actually physically own the IP for our Canada reactor technology, which was, again, tailor-made for Canadian industrial capabilities. So we can make the entire reactor in-house. We avoid the need for heavy forgings by modularizing the core into a pressure tube style design. We do not need to enrich uranium. We're able to use that, 5 to 20% uranium ore grade in Camacho, mill it a little bit, turn it into yellow cake, press it into pellets, load it into to very simple fuel bundles, which haven't changed much in 60, 70 years, and feed those bad boys into our reactors, sort of guaranteeing real energy sovereignty. And we have an extraordinary return on investment as a result of the peculiarity of this design. We've been able to build it all in Canada. We, for our refurbishments, something like 90 to 95% of all the components are made in this, diverse industrial ecosystem that's spread across mostly the province of Ontario, but extends a little more broadly. And we get an extraordinary economic multiplier from these investments. From the Darlington refurbishment, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has said we get $1.40 back in GDP activity for every dollar spent. So an extraordinary return on extraordinary large investments. People talk about just the Bruce site. This is going to be a $50 to $100 billion investment. Canadian dollars, do your conversions. But Ontario's looking to spend a lot of capital on these projects. And, the Ontario government, I think, is waking up to the reality that it is going to be backstopping a lot of this, the federal government as well. And I think there's a growing awareness that we need to make a decision that will take into account not just the value of all of the construction work. And because nuclear is such a massive construction project, I feel like we get very myopic about, okay, what's the economic benefit? And no matter what reactor technology you build, you're going to be pouring a lot of concrete. That is a sort of by nature a local economic activity. But as Michael was saying, the real economic model here, at least with Western vendors, is you lose money probably on the construction because we just kind of suck at construction. But the profit rolls in from the 40, 60, 80, maybe 100 years of fuel, of engineering services, of major component replacements. And for Canada, with its Canada reactor fleet, because all of that expertise, that IP is in the country, we are still reaping those rewards on our refurbishments, as I mentioned, that massive economic multiplier. For a Westinghouse industrial stack, if we were to build AP1000s moving forward in Ontario, that 80 to 100 year services, fuel, major components does not come from the Canadian ecosystem. And so the pitch that's being made to Canadians by Westinghouse is, listen, guys, you're going to get it's going to be a smaller piece, but it's going to be a bigger pie. Join us in this massive, we'll see how massive it is, how many reactors the U.S. can actually build for 80 billion. Maybe the Polish builds, et cetera, and you're going to get a chunk of the supply chain activities. That has really fallen through as a compelling narrative in the trade war that we find ourselves in with the U.S. We have this auto pact, or we had it until it was challenged, I think, partially by Japan at the WTO. But we have this incredible, generous history of, Canada actually having quite high tariffs on autos and forcing the big three automakers in the U.S. to do small production lines in Canada to service a market sort of pre-1960s. And there was a deal made between then Prime Minister Lester Pearson and LBJ at the LBJ Ranch, which created this incredible cooperation within the auto sector and really industrialized Ontario, gave continental access really for Canada to U.S. markets. Trump has denounced this as having been a huge steal by Canada of what is rightfully an American automotive sector. And so this rosy picture that, hey, build AP1000s and America out of its beneficence and generosity is going to give you a big chunk of the pie. It just doesn't stand up to analysis for me, particularly in an America First moment, and particularly with potentially some payback to the Japanese for making what are absolutely massive investments. They have the heavy industry. They still have heavy forges. They can make reactive pressure vessels in Japan. I think they're more likely to be integrated into a U.S.-centric supply chain for those U.S. AP1000s, and that despite the ASME stamped labor that we have here, the incredible industrial ecosystem we've built up for a $26 billion refurbishment project, that will pretty quickly get dwarfed and even tariffed in terms of our contributions to U.S. AP1000s. So I'll leave the rant there, but hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture of Canadian benefits. We're going to mine more uranium, particularly for Western reactors. We are going to see stock valuations go up. I mean, Camacho is up 20% on October 28th. If you holded Camacho shares, you're a happy man or woman. Brookfield went up about 4.2%. So for investors, it was a good deal. But again, I just want to close with, ownership does not mean control when it comes to technologies as strategic as nuclear, where export control laws apply and where this technology is also part of a Westinghouse national mythology. So I'll leave it there. Rant over.
I think you have some excellent points about the Canadian point of view and energy sovereignty within Canada. I certainly agree that in the post-neo-liberal world, I mean that in an economic sense, where globalization is not dead, but it is certainly being challenged by countries like the U.S. And I would say the U.S. is not alone in taking this approach, where domestic production and domestic supply and energy security is becoming certainly more important. But if we look at this $80 billion deal as the focus, I don't think it is unreasonable to say that the majority of the economic impact and benefit would be within the U.S. I think it would be somewhat strange that, Canada is going to massively benefit from a project going on south of the border. Yes, the owners are in Canada. So like with this arrangement and the ongoing arrangement that has been in place so far, I mean, like I said, Westinghouse has already paid out $100 million in cash dividends to its owners in Canada. So that is a small amount compared to the overall investment, but it is some money that is going north to Canada. The other thing I think would be important to keep in mind, especially Brookfield as the first purchaser of Westinghouse, Brookfield is not a utility. They're not a industrial manufacturer. They're a private equity management company. And their goal is to take a perhaps depreciating or valuable asset and turn it around and to make it into something more profitable. And I think this deal, especially with the exit option now to go onto the public market, is exactly what private equity tries to do. They take up a company and make the improvements, realign where it's headed, and then try and sell it off later for a profit. And in that case, I would say Brookfield, as a Canadian management company, has probably done an excellent job. I mean, there's still a few years to go, but Brookfield certainly looks to be in a position now, and Camacho with them, to become more profitable. Speaking of Camacho, if these reactors get built, Westinghouse AP1000s, let's say they're done reasonably priced or even if they're over budget, if they do come online, Camacho itself certainly stands to benefit, along with a number of other Canadian mines, particularly in Saskatchewan, and especially now with the closure of the uranium supply from Russia. Canada, in the mining industry, the conversion industry, would definitely stand to benefit. And a lot of that is then going to be in Saskatchewan, the Port Hope facility that you mentioned in Ontario. And Westinghouse, even further to that, has signed MOUs. I know we don't normally view MOUs as very strong levels of commitment, but it is something. Westinghouse signed an MOU with BWXT Canada to supply heavy industrial parts, steam generators, reactor vessel components, and other things, heat exchangers that would be needed for AP1000s and these other projects. Whether or not that actually materializes into contracts, we'd have to see. I think we'd need to see contracts for AP1000s first. Of course, Westinghouse isn't going to buy, steam generators before the plants are actually constructing. But it is a bit more of this back and forth of the supply chain across the border. And I think even one more example, I know you don't like the project, Chris, but the BWRX 300 in Darlington is another example where we don't have any formal USMCA type of agreement here or auto pact agreement, but there is still a lot of back and forth. The prime contractor on the BWXT 300 is Canadian in partnership with an American firm, along with GE Hitachi. So there is a lot of flow of not only information, but technology and skills and labor going back and forth. And similarly, that the same contractor that is building the BWRX 300 in Darlington, I think it's Aecon and Kiewit, they have also now signed a contract with Energy Northwest Utilities in Washington State for the plants that would come up there, small modular reactors. Again, a little bit farther away, but I would argue that we still see, despite rhetoric and politics and tariffs and a lot of uncertainty, that there is still a fair amount of back and forth of technology and equipment and know-how. I mean, we have Canadian companies on both sides. We have American companies working on both sides. Uranium primarily coming from America. Enrichment services look like in the future they will probably be coming from America or from Europe. And so the supply chains are still quite linked. And I would actually even add further to that, discussions at the joint review. So the BWRX 300 is being jointly reviewed by the Canadian regulator, CNSC, and the US NRC. And actually the UK has also joined that pact as well. And at least at the working level, it is quite cordial and productive. The expertise that is on one side of US NRC's experience with boiling water reactors. Canada has excellent experience on how to manage inspections, and the two are coordinating and cooperating quite well in order to make that project work. So I push back a little bit on the idea that Canada's not going to get anything out of this deal. Again, the construction is in the US, so the majority, I would expect the benefits to be there. Some amount of the profits will flow north, but there are opportunities for a variety of contractors on both sides, and possibly even Japan and Korea as well. They're also involved in a number of other similar projects in the US. So I think it's maybe not as bad as it might appear at first glance.
I'll just very quickly, I mean, I definitely do appreciate that nuance, and you bring a very deep knowledge of the sector. And I don't have a huge amount of pushback there. Of course, things are a little more nuanced than my, my chest beating that I gave there. But what I would say is that this trade war is still quite young, and a lot of what has happened was put into progress before that. And the bigger thing is this just huge delta between Canada's decision on which technology to build down the road, and I think that is much more consequential, and for reasons that I gave in my long diatribe, the thing where the rubber really meets the road. But I definitely concede, certainly up until now, and going into the future, there are some opportunities. Again, a smaller piece of a pie in terms of the kind of spectrum of activities that are available, but I definitely take your points, Michael.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, though, Michael. I think you sort of just reminded me. I mean, one context that I probably should have said from the very beginning is that the U.S.-Japan investment arrangement, deal, agreement, whatever you'd like to call it, is actually not just a pure sort of pure play negotiation about how we can work together, collaborate, etc. It comes on the back of U.S. initially imposing a 25% tariff on Japan unilaterally, and then saying, according to what we've heard, is at least during negotiations, saying for every large major investment project that you put your money into, we'll shave 1 percentage point off the tariff. So, however, they managed to agree at the end, and obviously the list of so-called investment deals that come with the announcement is a lot more than 10. It's not clear what stage these projects are. Some of them are probably extremely nascent, maybe even just on a paper basis at this moment. But in any case, essentially, the US has agreed to lower the tariffs to 15% on the back of this sort of commitment. So if we're talking about benefits, and especially if we're talking about cross-border supply chains, you also have to factor in that this is a little bit coercion, isn't it? Really, that you're sort of saying we want to collaborate, but you have to do this, otherwise we will put the tariffs on high on you. And then once you also remember that background, then how does all the cross-border trade work? Because then it's sort of essentially it's saying that Japanese vendors, yes, you will benefit, but if you're going to be producing a lot of the equipment in Japan, then that will be subject to tariffs, right? And that will actually make it more expensive, and that's not good from a US project cost basis, right? That's essentially going to be slapping an extra 15% cost on any large or small components that you're ordering from Japan. So you're going to say, from the US side, you're going to say to Mitsubishi Heavy, why don't you build that factory in the US? So maybe the investments that we're talking about, maybe those investment numbers are essentially sort of throwing the gauntlet down to Hitachi, Toshiba, Mitsubishi Heavy, and so on, and saying all the current sort of capacities that you have in Japan are not really of interest to us. We want you to create new factories in in the US. Certainly, there has been some announcements already of Japanese companies building new manufacturing facilities in the US, and I'm sure many of them would like to do that to a certain point. But if we, since Chris, I think very eloquently was arguing about the difference between what a company earns and what sort of a national sort of viewpoint might be, then I think in this case, sure, some more orders for a Japanese company that manufactures, essentially has to transfer its technology and manufacturing know-how to the US versus Japan as a country. I mean, I'm not sure, you could argue that we're hitting both spots, If it is a case of, look, we'll just buy a lot of things from Japan, then why are there tariffs?
I think if I can, since Michael and Chris were pushing back on each other, I found that very interesting, Yuri, your point about the tariff implications for the supply chain impact. I'd like to know how, and I know it's early after these announcements, but so far, Yuri, how does it look like Japan is receiving, how does it look like the nuclear industry or perhaps the politics there are receiving these deals? Because I think that you're right in noting that, depending on how generous you want it to be, you could interpret this as just the feudal payment for protection, or you could interpret this as just a big gamble because if enough AP1000s do get built out, a lot of that supply chain has origins in Japan. And so there could be real benefits to Japan if there was a big enough build out. But I'm curious how it seems like Japan is taking that deal, which way they're viewing it.
Look, I mean, there's definitely some positive noises. I think part of it is, I think there was a little bit of a relief, just simply that Trump went away without, getting angry and slapping in a random, 50, 100% tariff on something, just because, we've just literally got a new prime minister. She became a prime minister, I think, about a week before the Trump visit. She didn't have much time to prepare, so it went well, and managing that visit and essentially the orchestration of it was definitely a big positive that got talked about. There is, as I said, Japanese companies, as far as I'm aware, have never actually built a nuclear power plant outside of Japan, the entire plant, right? So that was one of the strategies that Toshiba had in buying Westinghouse, and they massively overpaid, of course, because they really wanted to be able to secure deals in other countries, not because Japan was, and I think still gets viewed very favorably as the builder of, let's say, the power island, and certainly a lot of the containment vessels and many other sort of heavy duty components, but pretty much all the bids, all the Japanese companies put in Turkey, in Asia, and elsewhere, they lost. So being brought into a lot of new nuclear power plant construction projects is definitely a positive, right? As long as the terms of those contracts are favorable. There is also, but. And this is where some of the criticism in Japan is sort of starting to come through. So what happens, for example, if, let's say, there is a nuclear power plant project announced, and then it does, the costs balloon, and then the Japanese side says, well, we don't want to proceed with that investment. Then what happens? Does then the US say, okay, you don't want to proceed? That's fine. We're going to chalk up the tariffs one point. Do we get into that? How far does it go? Does it get raised over one project? Is there some kind of rule? I don't know that there are any specific guidelines. As Trump's second term comes closer to the end, will he be as excited, by this particular momentum? Will the next administration continue with the same commitments? I mean, these are all questions that Japan is very worried about, especially as, again, to kind of digress a little bit to the Alaska LNG project, which is a massive, massive investment project with possibly even less, potential benefit for Japan. I'm not going to say zero, but certainly a lot less benefit to Japan. If Japanese companies commit massive dozens of billions of dollars right now, and the next administration is a Democrat administration that says, actually, we don't want to pursue LNG as aggressively anymore, and this project doesn't make sense, then what happens? So there is a lot of concern about the rules of engagement. There is some cautious optimism in terms of potential future nuclear contracts, but there's also quite a few voices, even from the mainstream, saying, wait, we're kind of giving up our sovereignty rights. We're essentially being used as a milked for our capital, and this is potentially damaging because investments that could be made maybe more favorably towards Japanese companies, which, as the Japanese government should, in theory, be supporting its own industry, could be diverted, essentially just given over to the US government, and which would, of course, more likely invest with its own sort of national priorities.
I just had a question kind of for Michael, which is, as I was mentioning, I have this thesis that nuclear is need to have, not nice to have. And, the nuclear renaissance we saw in the early 2000s was in part a response to the high price of oil. This was pre-fracking when the U.S. was looking at building LNG import terminals, the cost of natural gas. I mean, it went all over the place, but I think Henry Hub peaked at something like $14 or $15. George W. Bush was visiting nuclear power plants. Nowadays, though, like the U.S. doesn't seem to need nuclear, and as we've seen, construction takes very generous to say 8 to 10 years, probably 10, 12, hopefully much better than Vogel, but that's a pretty sad starting point. How much of this, like in your perspective, is sort of a national prestige or kind of culture war issue? If we're really trying to get data center capacity online quickly, does the U.S. really need nuclear to do that? Sorry, I'm sort of jumping into the host chair for a second here, just pushing the conversation along. But I'm really curious, from your perspectives as a bona fide American.
Yeah, I'll take that, and then I want to respond to Yuri's comment about tariffs and importing and that sort of thing. So first, I think you're right. Does the U.S. need nuclear? The current administration would probably say yes. Even the Democratic administration would probably generally lean towards yes. There was an interesting survey that was put out, I think it was by the Radiant Energy Group, about who favors what types of energy. And it's somewhat counterintuitive because the parties or the people that generally align with climate change and that sort of thing are not so strong on nuclear. Meanwhile, parties that maybe are more climate skeptic, like the Republican Party, tend to be strongly supportive of nuclear. So despite nuclear being a clean energy source, it's from at least a climate perspective, it's not so strongly engaged by the party that you think it would, and it is supported by the other. The narrative, of course, now has generally shifted towards, not that climate change is no longer important, but the narrative has shifted a little bit more towards energy security, particularly in Europe. And even the U.S. is now saying, we want energy security, we want cheap energy, we want to be able to do that. And we see nuclear as part of the solution in order to do that. Does the U.S. absolutely need energy? I think in a worst case scenario, so let's say uranium runs out tomorrow, is the U.S. going to shut down and turn off? No, the U.S. is fortunate enough, at least at this point, to not be in that situation. There are substantial natural gas reserves, coal, which has been somewhat phased out. The current administration has been keeping coal plants running for longer than their expected lifetime, sometimes at the complaint of the owner-operators, but nonetheless, it's still available. So in the worst-case scenario, is nuclear absolutely required in the U.S.? No. But there is, as you called it, a little bit of an ego thing. There is a bit of a bragging right or perception that nuclear energy has this connotation of technologically advanced. It's powerful. It's reliable. It's, I don't want to say it's like a metaphor, but you're building a giant nuclear power plant and it produces a whole lot of energy and it produces, electricity for everybody and all these great things that we're going to do. And it's going to be so cheap and we're going to be, winning. You're going to get tired of winning or whatever the phrase was. So I think it is partially driven by energy security, partially driven by a little bit of this wanting to be technologically dominant. And then once you get a little bit farther beyond that into the geopolitical space of Russia and China, I know we haven't talked so much about what their programs look like, but the Trump administration very much views that exports and control over what other countries can do. Yuri's talking a lot about, what is the arrangement with Japan. But the Trump administration views, okay, if we can make exports, we can, reduce the trade deficit. This is one of Trump's big things. This is originally, quote unquote, the driver for the tariffs. And one way you can do that, of course, is by exporting nuclear reactors. The AP1000 kind of seems to have taken the position for that for the U.S. with a number of projects either announced officially or under discussion compared to some of the other options. So to Yuri's point about, okay, what's going to happen with the production of, let's say, MHI making steam generators or some other, large component that Japan is quite good at. And in the administration view of this, I don't want to call it nostalgic, but, if you look back at what is the large industries in particularly the 1980s, when Trump is, kind of at that not impressionable age, but, he's coming into his own professional life. Japan in the 1980s is seen as this, definitely going to overtake the US, industrial, technological masterpiece. And so Japan certainly still is exceptionally good at manufacturing. I know a number of the large components for US plants are manufactured in Japan, and they run great. And the administration may be seeing that as, okay, can we get that over here as well? And one of the executive orders was reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base. This was one of the 4 executive orders that Trump issued earlier this year. And so I would probably concede to Yuri then that the long-term goal of this probably is to capture some of that technology and building know-how within the US. This is the other thing that the current administration talks about a lot, is building up the manufacturing capabilities of the United States. It's been lost, probably in his mind, largely to Japan. And so if you can get Japanese investment into either building new factories or transferring that knowledge, then it becomes capability that's within the US. And then the last point that you made, Yuri, if, let's say, it takes 10 years to build a factory, a heavy forging capability within the US, if it does go in that direction, in the meantime, you need heavy components before then. I think the administration is quite flexible, I'll use that term politely, on where tariffs are applied. Like uranium from Canada right now is exempt from the tariffs. Oil from Canada is exempt from the tariffs. Anything that the administration views, I think, as critical or important to national security generally has been exempt. Sometimes iPhones as well, because people like iPhones. But if large components like steam generators, reactor vessel components were manufactured in Japan, while the factory is perhaps under construction in the US, I would not be surprised if such large components were then, exempt from any tariffs, because it's part of a larger, broader approach to industrialization within the United States.
I've got a couple of points, and then I think maybe a final question, perhaps. First of all, I thought that I was going to be coming on this getting a lot more clarity around this deal, but I mean, it seems like everyone is just in agreement that there's a lot to be determined. I actually was talking to Allison McFarland, the former NRC commissioner, about this. And the first thing she said when she picked up the phone was, "Can you tell me what this thing's about?" And I was like, I was hoping you could do that for me. But the other thing I'd say is on the notion of nuclear being need versus nice in the United States. And I hope this builds off of what you were saying, Michael, is that it might not be a need right now. Well, we have LNG that is fairly plentiful and cheap, and well, we still have a few coal plants left, but looking forward in the long term over the coming decades, not that Washington thinks that far ahead, to be frank, but I think very much that that's often how I envision the rollout of nuclear for things like data centers is, to your point, Chris, it's not going to be the thing to service this first wave of proliferation, probably because the timelines are just too long. But for longer term sustainability, that's kind of how I envision, and when I talk to hyperscalers and data center developers, that's often how they talk about it, is some amount of, look, we might have to use LNG in the short term, but truly, we think that nuclear needs to be our decades-long solution. I think my last question that I have that kind of stuck out at me when first I heard about this $80 billion partnership is whether this is the United States picking a champion, a national champion. And Michael, in your Atomic Blender video, you use this term that I think I'm going to borrow now of MAGA industrial socialism, which I thought is quite appropriate because unlike France, unlike China, this is, this deal does not leave open the door for full U.S. government control of Westinghouse, but it does provide for potentially a significant equity stake. And I find that very interesting. So I'm curious, Michael, from your perspective, does this partnership indicate that the Trump administration has sort of picked a designated, nuclear company or a designated large conventional reactor company or anything of that sort?
Yeah, so on MAGA industrial socialism, I cannot claim full credit for that. I think it was more of a joint effort from a group chat. But I do think it is a fitting title. So if we look at what China is doing. Maybe that's the most analogous situation, where you had in the past a large number of companies that were entering the nuclear space. And over time, the government, during that time, it supports, 40 of them. 40 of them gets whittled down to 3 or 4, whatever we're at now. We have China General Nuclear, CNNC, and a lot of these now are joint companies, and they have joint projects together. So you started with a lot of companies that the Chinese government, either directly or indirectly through state-owned enterprises or through state banks, is providing financing for them to develop. The most fit of those companies, the one that makes the design that other state-owned enterprises want to purchase. We'll leave the politics of selection and favoritism aside, but ideally the one that is the strongest comes out of these 40, and that's the design that gets built. And China has now down-selected basically to 2 designs, and Chris had a guest on recently who talked about this, where we now have the Haolong 1, which is probably the primary one, and you have a few of the CAP 1000s or CAP 1400s, which are basically derivatives of the Westinghouse AP 1000. And what has happened in China is the government has directed state money towards these companies. These companies then get land at the provincial level very cheaply, because in China, the land that's available for projects is leased under these long-term agreements from the provinces. Government support on state banks that provides for construction. You have state-owned enterprises up and down the supply chain in China. And if you compare that then to what historically has been in the US, where you have a lot of private companies, Westinghouse used to be somewhat vertically integrated, same with General Electric. You had Combustion Engineering, some of these other companies before, and then they start to split off. They privatize. The enrichment services used to be government owned. It got spun off, eventually goes out of business, and then kind of comes back now as a private company. The Trump administration, I think, looks at that model that we have and looks at the Chinese model, and somewhat similarly the Russian model as well, and says, these guys are killing us internationally. Their prices are way down. They've got all the heavy industry, one of the Trump administration's favorite things to talk about, all integrated under one company and controlled and influenced by the state. When we get to what we're calling MAGA industrial socialism, if you called it what it probably more accurately is, which is just straight up socialism, where the government is directing things to go, that's certainly not going to be very palatable with definitely the Republican base, and even I think the Democratic base would probably recoil a little bit at that. So it's coming at it from a fairly unique perspective, where the government is intervening. There's no argument about that. If the U.S. government is signing a contract with Westinghouse to build $80 billion of plants, that's government intervention one way or the other. But it's being done in a way where the U.S. government it's being presented at least that the U.S. government is getting a potential profit stake from that. That's very clearly laid out in the announcement, where it's, profit is mentioned, 20% of all profits above this level, and equity stake, after this point, it's going to be fantastic. The American taxpayers are going to make money on this. But it is definitely selecting a winner, saying that, okay, behind that $80 billion is a lot of government support. It's not state-owned banks, and it's not state-owned, land being given to them, but it's taxpayer money that's going to come in the form of loan guarantees. It's going to come in the form of investment tax credits and production tax credits. And this kind of behind-the-scenes patchwork, the government's not directly buying the plant and building it, but it is supplying and subsidizing through a lot of these mechanisms in order to make it happen. And the government, at least so far, I don't know, maybe we'll see future deals as well, but is selecting Westinghouse and the AP 1000, in my opinion, likely because it has the one that has already built some plants in the US and appears to have the strongest international potential. So as far as picking winners, yes, that's what it appears the US government is doing.
Interesting. No, and I think your point about maybe it's just socialism, that was another thing that McFarland said. When I explained to her what I knew about the deal, she's like, oh, isn't that just socialism? I'm like, well, you might say MAGA industrial socialism. Briefly, I don't know if Yuri or Chris, you have any additional comments on sort of that subject there, but do you think that a partnership like this, or for that matter, the potential Japanese investment, do y'all have any thoughts on just how much more competitive this makes Westinghouse in terms of its AP1000 deployment and getting order and building out an order book there?
I think Michael did a perfect job there. I wouldn't have much to add. All I'll say is that, again, coming back to the Canadian perspective, when looking at this, there's people saying, well, maybe Canada should do something similar. Maybe, the whole Western political economy just doesn't suit the construction of nuclear power plants. And looking at this, there was, I think, quite a scandalous sale of Candu Energy Inc., a privatization effort after, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited was a total giant. In the 80s, Canada was building 13 large Candu reactors simultaneously in Canada and in 2 other countries abroad. And, as demand dwindled, capabilities dwindled, and there were a number of issues with their medical isotope protection. But suffice it to say, this branch was sold off at a pittance to SNC Lavalin, now Atkins Realis. But what is interesting in terms of a government stake is that Canada still does own the IP of Candu technology and has a revenue sharing agreement. The net present value calculated at the time of sale, Candu Energy Inc. was sold for $15 million, $15 million to SNC Lavalin at the time, but the net present value of future earnings as a result of those royalties was calculated at something like 275 million Canadian dollars at the time. I don't know what the assumptions are. It's not public what the revenue sharing is, but it is just interesting that we have some sort of very, very light dustings of socialism on our national reactor technology. And I just thought that was an interesting perspective that maybe the U.S. is just sort of catching up with.
I guess just to kind of close from me, I'll say maybe 2 things. I want to pick up maybe on the nice versus need kind of phrasing that you guys talked about. Japan is an island that is many islands, of course, but it's an island nation with no electrical transmission connection, no grid connections to any other country. It has no gas pipelines to any other country. So in that sense, it's very different from the situation in Europe where you have interconnectors, you have gas pipelines, you have common underground gas storage, or you have the US with at least Canada and Mexico as providing some form of ability to sort of borrow or trade. So Japan's decisions on energy are always made with the number one, energy security, in mind, and all the other things come as a kind of a secondary issue. So in Japan's sort of, if you like, institutional mindset, energy sector, think tanks, government mindset, nuclear and industry mindset, I would say that nuclear is seen as absolutely important, vital. Some people might not agree with this, but they see the fact that a nuclear reactor could be fueled for 3 years. Storage, of fuel could be and is able to be facilitated in Japan, and so that gives Japan a certain amount of time should the worst happen. Whereas all other forms of energy at this moment don't provide Japan with that kind of energy security. Gas, Japan doesn't have any underground gas storage, so Japan's ability to store LNG is about 2-3 weeks, which is tiny for such a major energy source. There is obviously no storage of hydrogen or ammonia, or very little of it. There is sort of a very, very nascent battery market, but I think we all know the battery isn't a long-term energy storage form. We have pumped hydro, one of the world's best pump hydro sectors, but again, this is, there is a limit to how much it can do. So, long story short, nuclear is seen as the longest form of energy storage in a way, in Japan. Therefore, at least keeping, what the government would like to do is at least keep nuclear at a 20% level. And that's going to require a huge amount of work. And it does require the building of new reactors, including in Japan, because the Japanese reactors themselves are getting quite old and they're will soon start to reach their sort of peak, the limit of their permits. So being involved in the US supply chain, having access to contracts, having an ability to retain and also recruit new skilled workforce, which is a huge issue given shrinking population, given the fall off from students' interest in studying nuclear engineering after the Fukushima accident, etc., is definitely a massive plus. So being part of supply chain is a plus. As I mentioned, there's no Japanese companies with their own, if you like, plant. So being sort of involved with, Westinghouse in new projects, potentially in third countries, etc. Also, given the Toshiba history, etc., isn't the worst thing in the world. Plus, obviously, Japan is also involved via Hitachi with GE, and so there's that. There is also the, if you like, the SMR angle. Again, I'm certainly less clued up in terms of how Westinghouse is going to able to develop its SMRs, but SMRs is something that Japan has never developed itself. There are some very, very early stage designs, but so GE Hitachi is kind of the only big realistic SMR option for Japan right now. So being involved in US nuclear developments with the idea that maybe if reactors work there and new designs are tried out and work well there, then maybe certain reactors designs or improvements or know-how and so on could also actually be repatriated back into the Japanese market is also again something that Japan considers as a potential positive. But I will say that the one thing that I find maybe a little bit troubling about the current situation is exactly what Michael was talking about with in the integrated supply chains. Because I was working in Russia in the mid 2000s, when Rosatom was literally being built, was being registered, and I saw how, there was a lot of effort taken by the government to put together very disparate institutions, heavy machinery factories, and so on, bring them into the same, on message, if you like, to understand that they're now a united company with a united purpose. That took a long time, despite Russia being much more vertically integrated as a government industrial complex than anything like, what we have in the US or even in Japan to a certain degree. And so I'm a little bit concerned, I suppose. I thought a recent Decouple episode on SMRs and the Russian sort of development of PWRs was great and exactly right about sort of having the engineers there and also having the factories aligned with what they're doing. I mean, unless US is able to develop that very, very structured complex, I'm not sure that, bringing in a lot of Japanese vendors to supply components would necessarily make that supply chain efficient or competitive to the level that we have in China. Great again. Right. So in that case, who wins? I'm not sure. Maybe the people, maybe the financial middlemen, really. That's my kind of somewhat skeptical, cynical view.
I think that was great, beautiful closing remarks, Yuri, and you brought us back to the notion that we still have a lot to see to really understand the impacts of these partnerships and potential investments that have been discussed recently. Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful globe-trotting episode of Decouple, if I dare say, and Yuri in particular. I know it's quite late over there in Japan, so thank you so much. Again, Yuri Humber, Michael Seeley, and obviously Chris Keefer. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.